The tent lurched under the force of his entrance, canvas jittering, maps slapping the table like startled birds. When General Thomas Patton's boot hit the dirt and his voice cracked the air, "I want air support before the bombers even take off." The words were a physical thing, thick with impatience and red glare, and they landed on Major Eleanor Hale with the bluntness of a gavel. Men around the map table flinched. Eleanor did not move. She had been taught to keep her hands where everyone could see them. But the world narrowed to the point where Patton's demand met Hap Arden's face, and something in her chest went wrong. The day she learned the difference between orders and consequences. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Patton's eyes were coals over a pile of unspent fury. He looked like a man who had lived by motion, by the sharp edge of doing, the kind of commander who measured worth by speed. Across the table, General Harrison Hap Arden stood like a line drawn in the dirt. Tall, square-shouldered, the crease between his brows carved by years of weighing lives against lines on a map. Hap's voice was the opposite of Patton's, low, deliberate, the kind that slid into silence and made it listen. "We can't commit fighters until we have a clear air picture," he said. "We risk more planes and men if we scramble blind." Eleanor had rehearsed her next actions in 100 different nightmares. How she would relay orders, how she would reason with captains whose crews slept on the wrong side of a prayer, how she would make the numbers quiet enough to sleep. She had not once, pictured General Patton storming the tent like a man who thought the rules were a nuisance rather than a life-preserving scaffold. She felt every eye sharpened to her. As the liaison, she stood between their two directions like a hinge on an overburdened gate. Patton's jaw ticked. Arden's hands were flat on the map, steady as a surgeon's. Eleanor felt the small tightness in her throat that meant only one thing. She would have to be the voice that walked back a promise. "You'll delay them until the preparatory window closes," Patton said. "That's not acceptable. We move now or my boys die." "And if we move now, more will die, or worse," Arden replied. "I'm not arguing the will to act. I am arguing the will to act with sight. There are flak corridors east of the ridge. There's cloud cover beginning at 300. Without fighters, the bombers are sitting ducks." Eleanor's job was arithmetic and empathy. She read weather reports, crew fatigue sheets, engine hours, the ticks and strengths of every pilot in the theater, and turned them into decisions that could be spoken without blood on her hands. She was the youngest operations liaison in the theater, 27, and made of too many late nights and too few reassurances. Men twice her age often looked at her like a clever engine in a machine that should be built by hands caked with a different dirt. She had earned their grudging respect with timetables and stubborn competence. Tonight, that respect felt like a brittle shield. "You want me to tell Patton," she started, and her voice betrayed nothing but a practiced call, "that we stand down while his men dig foxholes?" Patton rounded the table as if to rip the map into the open air. "I want air on the ground at 045, and I want it now. Tell Arden to give the order. He's the Air Corps. He gives air." Hap Arden's laugh was soft and unmoved. "And I want these men not to be birds clipped before they've even left the nest," he said. His eyes found Eleanor's with a look that was not quite apology and not quite command. "Major Hale." The way he said her name made her ears hot. His attention felt like a debt she might be called to repay with something more than the correct coordinates. She crossed to the table as if she had been tugged by a marionette string. Maps and markers blurred beneath the wash of lamplight. The tent smelled of petrol and wet wool and anxious human breath. "You will carry my refusal," Hap said, and his hand gestured to the list of constraints on the chart. Fighter availability, sortie timings, fuel margins. It was the precise kind of refusal that had teeth. Better informed than defiant, more defensive than cruel. "You will also carry the risk assessment. Patton needs to understand not just what he wants, but what that costs." Eleanor folded the papers with the care of someone closing a wound. Her mind, which had been kept busy cataloging schedules and crew rotations, suddenly found space for the more dangerous weather. The way Patton's gaze snapped like a scorpion. The way Arden's restraint wrapped around his grief like armor. And the fact that she, who had learned to carry numbers like lifelines, was now being asked to carry people's deaths with her. Patton tapped the map with a fingertip, hard enough that the pins trembled. Your constraints sound like excuses. We don't have time to scheme around consequences. Lives are in motion. Around the tent, murmurs rose, a chorus of loyalty and dread. Officers who owed their lives to Arden's decisions coughed discontent. Younger captains who wanted sweep and speed cheered silently for Patton's gusto. Eleanor felt the tug of both worlds, the urgent hunger to act, to save a squadron already counting heartbeats, and the cold arithmetic Arden delivered about daylight, anti-aircraft ranges, and fuel. Between those poles was a razor edge. She was to walk it. Her voice betrayed none of the tremor she felt. General Patton, General Arden, if I relay an order that commits fighters without a cleared air picture, I sign for the mission.
I sign the timing, the support windows, the fuel, and the contingency. I signed the lives. Patton's mouth flattened. Then stop signing for hesitation. Hap's eyes, patient as a river, slid to her in that slow, measuring way men used when they chose a confidant. If you sign without sight, you carry the names. If you stand with me, you carry the same. He spoke as if he meant to share a burden. For a dizzy moment, Eleanor thought maybe he did. Then Patton put both palms on the map and leaned forward. We are past counsel. We are at need. Make a choice, Major. Will you follow orders, or will you, and I'll say this plainly, obstruct? It was not a tone that could be argued with, a war of wills settled by the simplest weapon, accusation. Eleanor felt the air pressure shift. She had been promoted on her ability to tell truth to men who wanted to bulldoze it. Now she would have to tell a general that he could not have everything he demanded without paying for it. She thought of her crew, Eddie Collins with a laugh like a saw, luminous and quick, Lieutenant Mara Voss, who kept her bomber's nose clean and her hands steady, young Sergeant Lyle, who had a way of knotting his scarf at the same crooked angle every morning, because that was the day he had learned to keep something in place. They were not numbers to Eleanor. That was the difference between her and the maps. They were thin, bright lines that ran through her chest. She looked from face to face, Patton's fury like a storm surge, Arden's restraint like a levee. I will tell General Patton we cannot guarantee air support before takeoff, she said, and the words felt like a small bleached stone, necessary and terrible. We can provide fighters on orbit within 12 minutes of scramble, with a cleared vector once we confirm sightings and flak patterning. That, she swallowed, because diplomacy had to be an honest currency. That is the most we can promise without losing more than we can afford. Patton's lips curled, a smile like a slash. You give him enough time and he buries our boys. Arden was quiet for a long second. Then he said, simply, if the air picture is clear in 12 minutes, they have a fighting chance. If not, and we have committed resources, we will chase ghosts. He placed a hand flat on the map as if he could anchor the world to it. Eleanor left the tent with both paper and burden. Outside, the night smelled of burnt rubber and rain. The ground beneath her boots was uneven, the kind of earth that had been walked by men with both steady hands and bad nights. She could hear Patton's boots thudding as if he would follow her down every step of the world. Inside, the command net crackled with orders. Aircraft were already wheeling on the tarmac, engines a metallic hymn.
The radio operator looked to her with the kind of trust that makes a person feel too visible. She knew that in a moment she would put breath into a decision that would be obeyed by men with guns and by women with pilot's licenses and prayers. Her fingers hovered over the transmitter microphone. She had been the one who had charted the window 3 months ago, when a sortie had gone wrong. The one who had signed off on fuel allocation that had left a pilot circling for minutes he should not have had to earn. That mistake lived in her like a bruise. She had thought numbers could be trusted, that schedules were moral things. A plane had come down that night, and she had replayed the tape of it in the dark, over and over, imagining different decimals. No one knew she had bent to save fuel that night because the captain had begged. No one knew she had been the one to calculate the margin that failed. She had promised herself she would not let the same hand hesitate again. And yet Arden's carefulness had a kind of mercy to it that gnawed at her. He was not passive. He had earned his title and confesses and losses, but he held himself accountable in ways that the others did not. He had once told her, in a moment stripped of rank and ceremony,
that wars were measured in inches as often as in victories. That image had lodged somewhere warm and sharp in her, like a small coin you could clutch to remember you had paid a debt. As she keyed the microphone, the weight of the choice settled over her. She would tell Patton the truth and hold to Arden's limits. She would tell him that impatience could not be traded for safety. She would promise her crew that she had done the arithmetic of saving them and of losing them, and chosen the course that, to her mind, left the most hands whole. The radio flared at her lips. She began to speak. Behind her, unseen, Hap Arden watched from the flap of the tent, the slight sinking around his eyes that came from nights he spent awake negotiating angels and calculus. The lines of his face were steady, but not unwrinkled. There was a grief in his posture that deserved a confession and had earned none. Tonight, his measured refusal had set in motion 1,000 small reckonings. Eleanor could not yet see what they would cost, and none of them could foresee how Patton's demand would come to live in their bones. She finished the transmission, and somewhere men in hangars shifted, some in relief and some in fury. The tent hummed with the aftermath of decisions, the way a struck drum keeps ringing. Eleanor folded herself tighter in her jacket against the cold not of weather, but of consequence. At the edge of the encampment, the night sky was a cruel map of stars. Eleanor thought of the men she had signed for and of the one she might still lose. The choice she had made felt both right and fragile as glass. If Arden was right, perhaps 12 minutes could be the difference between triumph and disaster.
If Patton was right, perhaps hesitation would cost lives she had sworn to protect. She did not yet know which of them she would live with for the rest of her life, the truth as measured in maps and numbers, or the truth as felt in the sudden lumber of a friend who did not return. She did know one more thing with certainty. Being the bridge between generals meant more than carrying messages. It meant carrying consequences, and those consequences would ask everything of her, including the unfamiliar and dangerous demand of choosing whom she would ultimately serve. The logic of duty, or the raw, quick-beat hunger to act. By the time the bombers taxied out under a skeptical crescent moon, Eleanor had learned that being the youngest liaison did not protect her from being the person who must say no. She had also learned that being the woman in the room made her moves count twice, once for strategy, once for the way men would swallow them. As the first engines rolled and the radio crackled with reports, the fragile truce held, a paper bridge over a river of fury, and Eleanor felt, for the first time, the heavier pull of what she had promised to protect. The night ahead would be long, and already far too close. The bomber came back on 3 engines and a prayer, its belly pocked with black like a face that had been burned and kept speaking anyway. Eleanor heard the report before she saw the plane. A clipped voice over net. Broken wing, Lieutenant Maravas, returning. And then the static scratch that meant someone else was shouting. She ran, fingers still smelling of ink and cold, toward the field where shadows folded against the night. Her boots slipped in the mud and she did not care. The world had narrowed again, this time to one machine and the people it held. They pushed the bomber under floodlights. Crewmen staggered out like leaves from a torn tree. Mara leaned on Eddie Collins, bled at the corner of her mouth, mascara smudged into the exact same crooked line she made with her scarf. Sergeant Lyle walked without limping, but he walked as if a clock had skipped a second inside him. Somewhere in the cockpit, the navigator cursed and laughed and refused to be anything but alive. Hap Arden met Eleanor by the bowing silhouette of the plane. His hands smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and oil. He did not fawn or lecture. He stood like a man who had stepped into a room with a wound in it and needed to see how deep the cut ran. "You did what you could," he said, as if the words were both instruction and consolation. She wanted to say that she hadn't, that she had told Patton no and then watched faith and fury conspire in the dark to make a different kind of thing happen. Instead, she said, they made it back. Arden's jaw worked. They did. Tonight they did. Eleanor looked at the bomber's side where the fabric had been shot away and shivered at the exposed ribs. It was obscene and holy all at once, the naked structure of a thing that had been trusted to hold humans aloft. She thought of the night months ago when she had adjusted margins and a plane had not come back, and she felt that old bruise bloom into a fresh ache. Patton was not satisfied by the word survived. He demanded answers, men to blame, men to promote for bravery, as if medals could stitch wounds closed. He wanted the numbers to prove his instincts right. He wanted someone to declare the mission a success so the noise of doubt could be drowned. Arden resisted the rush to certainty. He watched men with wounds and soot-smeared faces and did not let them be turned into trophies. Where Patton saw momentum, Arden saw risk. It was in the raw hour after the landing, when engines cooled and boots were unsteady, that Eleanor and Arden found themselves alone in the operations tent again, the map table a constellation of pins and notes and folded tragedies. The tent smelled of burnt coffee and the particular sorrow of a place where decisions were made and people came home in pieces. "You shouldn't be out there," Eleanor said by way of greeting. He looked tired in a way that outlived physical exhaustion, a tired that belonged to a man who had been awake living in a ledger of costs. "I shouldn't be anywhere I can't help," he corrected gently. He set 2 mugs on the table and surprised her by offering one. For a beat, she thought he would light a cigarette and step outside, but he did not. He sat, fingers steepled. "You did the arithmetic, Major. You did what you thought would save the most." She touched the rim of the cup with 2 fingers, her hands still smelling of grease and fear. "You could have given them fighters sooner," she said. The question was a blade wrapped in paper. She did not know whether to cut or be cut. Arden hummed, a low sound that was almost a laugh without joy. "I gave them fighters as soon as the picture cleared. You told them what it would cost to scramble blind. You told him the truth." Her face must have shown the thing she could not say, that the truth had felt inadequate in the presence of Patton's certainty. He watched her without judgment, only attention, and the attention felt, in its way, like a confession being received. "Tell me about the night you signed off the margins," he said suddenly, not yielding to curiosity, but to construct. "Tell me why you made the calculation you did." She blinked because she had not expected him to pry, and because she feared being heard. She had built a myth of her competence, ordered, rational, impermeable, and the one person who had seen the bruise and not mocked it was this man who could ruin her with a single memorandum. "It was 1,000 little reasons," she said finally. "Captain asked. Engines weren't perfect. We were short on fuel. I thought I could make it safer by giving less. It made sense on paper."
"You signed for the risk of one plane to save others?" he asked. There was no accusation in his voice, only iron and calculation. "Yes." Her voice was small in the canvas. "I thought that was the moral thing." Arden's hand brushed hers, brief, unremarkable, and she felt the world rearrange itself into a map with new contours. The touch lasted the time it takes for a match to die. When he withdrew his hand, both of them seemed to have aged on the spot by years. "You did what you could with what you had," he said. "But Major?" He paused, the pause filling with everything he did not say. "We cannot let the calculus become a shield for cowardice, or the opposite. We cannot let passion be the only instrument of command." She swallowed. His words were both a rebuke and a permission. They rolled over her, cooling and yet igniting a modest, private ache. The ache of needing to be seen and understood without being remade into someone else's truth. They talked until the tide of the night thinned, and the tent creaked like an old man settling in his chair. Outside, the world kept moving, engines idling, the occasional shout. But inside, their conversation became a medicine with bitter taste and quick relief. Arden told stories not of triumph, but of wrong roads he had chosen, because they were easier to justify than to bear. He told of a day when he had ordered a flight he had later lined to regret, and how years after, the memory had become a ledger he could not balance. He did not blame himself with the bright violence of self-flagellation. He catalogued instead, as if by listing he might make sense. Eleanor told him of the plane that did not come back and the hollow it had left inside her. She confessed not in the formal language of reports, but in the lean, urgent language of someone who had woken in the dark and listened for a sound that never came. There was a moment when she expected him to say that she had been wrong, to administer the kind of masculine judgment that would cut much and heal nothing. Instead, he said, "You carried that night as if it were yours alone." His statement landed like the first honest thing in a long while. In it, she heard both accusation and plea. Stop hiding. Let someone else shoulder some of this weight. They worked out a plan, as if strategy might mend what fear had bruised. Arden would request a full debrief of the sortie under the guise of operational refinement. Eleanor would prepare reports that stated facts and not excuses. Together, they would make sure credit and responsibility were properly distributed. It was a cautious truce,
equal parts career salvation and moral reconstitution. Later, when the tent thinned to one lone radio operator and the distant hum of men catching their breath, Arden stepped outside and leaned against the frame. He lit a cigarette and inhaled with the sort of deliberation that made the smoke look like a thought given shape.
Eleanor stood beside him a moment later, the night pressing against her back. He did not ask her to come. She simply drifted toward his light the way others might drift to a safe harbor. They smoked in silence, the smoke a gray ribbon between them. "You could walk away from this and go back to a desk," she said, not looking at him but at the horizon where the base's lights shimmered like a distant constellation. "And let you carry all of it?" He sounded almost affronted. Not a chance. His eyes shone with a gravity she had not expected to see in a man everyone called Hap. Hap, as if to soften the title of a general into a nickname. Arden, as if his name contained both weather and mercy. "You are useful, Major. More than that, you are right when you are scared." Her laugh was ironic and sharp, and then it broke. "Scared is not the word that wins medals, General." "No," he admitted, "but it should be part of the file." His hand found hers in the dark, fingers closing like a promise or a hazard. She could have pulled away and kept the neat lines of professionalism intact. Instead, she kept her palm open. The touch was not a conflagration. It was a small thing, grounding, dangerous, simple. It said more than either of them could afford to say aloud, that they were no longer merely general and liaison, but two people who had bared their inner ledger to one another and found it matched in parts. When the cigarette died and they walked back to the tent, their shoulders brushed at one point and electricity ricocheted through Eleanor like a static shock. She was young and expendable in some minds, and steady and necessary in others. She had always known the risks of being small and necessary in a room of giants. She had not, until now, fully known how intoxicating it could be to have one of those giants consider you necessary in a different way. The next morning, Patton's fury had not cooled. He paced like a caged animal, demanding audits and lists, promotions and punishments. He wanted someone to declare victory and someone else to be held accountable. Arden offered neither. He offered instead a sobered report and a schedule for improved reconnaissance. The clash of their styles, Patton's blitzkrieg of will against Arden's mortar of forethought, became something the rest of the tent watched with the giddy dread of a crowd watching two storms collide. Eleanor was at the map table when Patton suddenly pointed at a coordinate and barked, "There, send a strike team, make it quick." His finger was a spear. Arden looked at the map and then at the clock. Something invisible and sharp passed between the two generals like the flick of a closing trap. "Not without verified intel," Arden answered, "and not with the fighters tied up in the current window." "You delay and you die," Patton shot back. "You throw and you lose more than you gain," Arden returned. Eleanor felt the old familiar itch of being the hinge.
She thought of the bomber 3 nights ago, and of the fight for the narrowest margins. Patton's anger felt reasonable in a different register. Arden's caution felt merciful and exact. Her fingers hovered over the radio, and in the pause, a kind of invisible vote was being taken. Would they choose momentum or prudence? She made a decision that looked like compromise and smelled like betrayal to some. She allocated a small recon element, enough to verify and not enough to be a full strike. It was a sliver of action, a note that said, "We will not stand idle, but we will not rush like the blind either." Patton raged as if she had stabbed him. Arden watched her with something like pride and something like fear. For the first time, being the bridge felt not like being a hinge, but like being a keystone. If she failed, everything might shift and collapse. When the recon returned with data that was ambiguous rather than decisive, Patton's fury found new shape. He demanded that the strike proceed anyway. Arden, narrow and inflexible in his refusal, said no. Eleanor felt the weight of both men's wills pressing on her like the ocean. And in that pressure, something else unfurled. A realization that being in love with the truth, Arden's truth, Eve's truth, her own truth, would cost her more than sleepless nights. It would ask her to stand with a man whose rank made her future fragile. It would also give her a strange, hot courage. She did not know yet whether her courage would save anyone, or whether it would merely mark her for blame. She only knew she did not be the woman who stitched numbers into excuses any longer. She could not stand between men and let their temper be the law. She would stand where she must, and then she would learn to face the consequences. That night the base was restless. Men whispered in bunks, the sound of 100 private reckonings. Eleanor stayed in the operations tent, hands on the map, watching lines like veins. Arden sat across from her, not imposing but present. Between them was the strange intimacy of shared labor, of two people who could hold a decision and the fallout together. A new day would bring new demands, new tempests. Patton was a force that could not be easily redirected. The recon report had not given them absolution, and the choice to act remained a knife edge. Eleanor felt it all, the tug of duty, of love, of career. She had begun to understand that to love in this place meant often to choose the lesser hurt, and that love could be both a salve and a weapon. As dawn crept over the horizon and painted the map in cold blue, Arden reached across and set his palm flat on the paper, his fingers splayed like a constellation. "You will not be alone in this," he said, not as command, but as a vow. Her chest tightened. It was a vow she had not expected, and could not fully accept with fear.
She nodded, the gesture both a promise and an admission. She would stand with him, or stand against him, depending on what the world asked and what conscience demanded. The air between them thrummed with things unsaid, with the dangerous thrill of proximity. Beyond the flap of the tent, the engines waited, impatient and unknowing. Patton would not be made quiet by anything but success, and Arden would not yield the lives entrusted to his care without a fight that bled restraint. Eleanor, for the first time, felt the delicious and dangerous weight of being someone who mattered in more ways than one. The choices ahead would not be neat, the tide of war rarely is, but she had a man who would stand beside her, a general who could give her not orders, but integrity, and she had a truth to protect, that lives were not statistics to be traded for glory. The push and pull of duty and desire had become braided, and somewhere in that braid, a fragile hope took root, that love could be found in the calculus of consequence, and that together they might find a way to keep more hands whole than not. As the first light broke, and men began to move like cogs set in motion, Eleanor readied herself for the next round. Patton would press, Arden would counter, and between them she would be the voice that named the cost of action and the cost of withholding it. The night had shifted something irrevocably inside her. An armor of reluctance, yes, but also a tender knowledge that she could ask for help, and that sometimes asking was the only brave thing left to do. The next call crackled across the net like thunder. The air smelled of rain, of fuel, and of the particular electricity of impending risk. Eleanor put her hand on the microphone, felt Arden's presence behind her like a second heart, and spoke into the radio, steady, certain, and impossibly human. The first bomb that fell on the convoy came like a verdict, sudden, final, and loud enough to erase the smaller sounds of the base for a breathing moment. The radio screamed with a new frequency of panic. Someone cried a name that meant nothing to Eleanor beyond the sound of grief. Men who had argued in the tent 2 hours before were now red-handed with smoke and salt. The recon had not been a mere hesitation. It had been an aperture through which catastrophe rushed. She heard the transmission as if it were not meant for her. Unauthorized scramble, close air support vector engaged, bogies in the valley, repeat, bogies engaging friendly convoy. The net splintered with voices. This is command, withdraw, negative, who authorized? The question landed on her like a thrown stone, and for an instant the world stood in the way a throat might kill a man, choking, quick. Patton's voice came through, all iron and accusation. We moved. I ordered the support. We could not wait. Hap Arden's reply was a low thing, more a revelation than a rebuttal. You had no authority to redirect fighters without verification. Those fighters were tied to another mission. The answer that followed was the sound of a plan unmade. The fighters who were diverted had been the thin thread between the bombers and survival. When they were gone, the enemy's flak had found a fullness in the sky that had been denied them before. A bomber did not come back. A second came back on half its wings. The pilots spoke in short sentences, their syllables edged with a new, raw silence. Eleanor felt the map table tilt beneath her feet, though she stood miles away. Somewhere in the meat of her chest, something that had been stitched murmured, and then gave. She ran, breath cutting, to the operations tent, where Arden already stood, his face carved of decisions. You authorized a diversion? She demanded, before she could fold the question into the report. The accusation was small and terrible. It meant she suspected him of something she could not yet name. No, he answered. Patton did. He ordered it through one of his liaison officers. His voice was an even keel, but his eyes were a storm. We have pilots down, Ellie. We have an overlapping chain of command that has been broken by someone's impatience. You told him no, she said, but the truth came out jagged and smaller. You told him we could not guarantee air before takeoff. I did, he said. I told him the risk. He decided to ignore it. The tent smelled of spilled coffee and the cold corrosive of a new fault line.
Men crowded the edges, wanting to be useful and not knowing how. Someone vomited. Someone else swore like a struck animal. Eleanor pressed her palms to the table until the skin felt funny and distant. "What did they lose?" she asked. The question was pragmatism trying to be faith. "2 pilots gone," Arden said. "A navigator. A bomber gone to Earth. We lost margin and we lost a knight's innocence." He looked at her, and the look was older than his years, younger than his command. And now Patton wants heads. There it was. The cost of impatience had currency in a room that did not believe in pity. Patton wanted names, lists, garnishments. He wanted the visceral relief of blame parceled out like rations. Eleanor's throat had been threaded with silence for so long that the first word she had to give felt like contraband. She told Arden the truth she had kept like a child keeps a bruise hidden under a sleeve. The night she had ratcheted fuel margins down. The calculation that had seemed, at one desperate minute, the only morally defensible trade. She spoke in the cold ledger of what had been done, and when she spoke, it was like uncorking a bottle that had been left in the sun. The smell was acid and immediate. Arden listened without interruption, his face a map of comprehension and a geography of lost chances. When she finished, the tent held its breath as if waiting for him to snap a verdict and end it.
"What was your reasoning then?" he asked, not to condemn, but to understand the way a surgeon asks why an incision was made. "I thought one for many," she said simply. "I thought the math of risk could be moral if it saved more than it cost. I thought expediency played fair with courage. I was wrong." There was shame in that last admission, but when she said it aloud, it shifted from a private acid burn into something that might be tended. Arden's hand found hers on the map, and this time the contact was not an accident. It was an anchor. "You were trying to buy time for others," he said. "That is not small." He withdrew his fingers as if they might be guilty by contact. "But you also put a man's life in your margin." The words were a blade in velvet. She felt them in every bone. "I know," she whispered. "That night never leaves me." For a long moment their shared confession made a delicate bridge, and then it was undercut by a step neither of them had planned. The hearing was called within hours. Patton wanted a sacrificial ledger. He wanted names and the spectacle of consequence. He suggested that an example be made. A liaison who had made a wrong call would suffice to reset discipline. A murmur went through the room, men eager for a balance, for a justice that had the neatness of a file folder. Arden's face blanched at the suggestion. "No," he said in a voice that had the force of a gavel. "We will investigate. We will look at the chain of orders." But his refusal, measured and official, could not transmute the undercurrent of power. Someone in Patton's circle had already begun to whisper Eleanor's name as a likely scapegoat. Someone else had realized that if they could attach negligence to a young woman's judgment, the narrative of the theater would shift from bold leadership to careless feudalism. The men who wanted momentum would be placated with a show of accountability. Eleanor felt the walls of the tent become a trap when she learned Patton had asked for a formal inquiry into liaison malpractice. The phrasing felt like a blade drawn across a throat and left there for everyone to see. She had always known rank could end careers. What they did not teach in training was how quickly rank could repurpose justice into theater. Arden moved with an urgency she had not seen on him before. He ordered evidence preserved, logs to be copied, statements to be taken. He rallied men who trusted him. He did not, however, become the bulldog she wanted. He became something more terrible to Eleanor. Remote, strategic, and implacable. He set up the defense as he might a complex operation, but in doing so, he kept his distance. He placed her at the center of the investigation he had promised to supervise, and curiously left a space between them that she tasted as abandonment. "Why are you stepping back?" she asked when they were alone, and the tense light made them companions in a painting.
Her voice was not accusation, so much as bewilderment. "We told the truth." Arden's eyes were worn and slow. "Because the enemy here is not just Patton," he said. "It is the perception of command. If we bind ourselves to sentiment, we risk the command structure crumbling into faction." His hand hovered between them and then fell. "I will fight for you, Eleanor, but I fight with the weapons I have: procedure, record, testimony." "You could have stood with me," she said, and the words had the sharpness of someone who had expected a different kind of courage. "I stood," he replied. "I stand." He exhaled as if the air between them had turned to wire. "But this
He tapped the folder of statements and logs as if it were a scalpel. "This is how I keep us from losing everything. You must understand that." She did understand, in the arithmetic of rank and consequences. But understanding is not always an antidote to hurt. The intimacy that had been quietly growing between them, the late conversations, the shared cigarettes, the quiet touch of hands that had meant more than mere comfort, now felt to her like a ledger she had misread. Arden was saving her by keeping his distance. In doing so, he was protecting both of them, and perhaps, more brutally, protecting his career over their fragile alignment. When the hearing convened, the tent was a courtroom of breath, and Patton sat like an accusing son. Witnesses gave testimony that favored promotable narratives, commanders who spoke of the need for speed, pilots who spoke of bravery. Arden's defense was steady, legal, filled with charts and weather logs and the crispness of procedural righteousness. He spoke for hours. He brought up chain of command protocols and cited prior infractions where haste had led to loss. His tone was precise. It cut a clean path through the chaos. Then Patton made his move. He produced an anonymous log entry, a notation of reduced margins from months prior. The implication hung in the air like brimstone. A liaison had compromised fuel margins once to save a life. That same liaison now sat at the center of a reckless decision. The insinuation was smaller than a fact, but louder than one. Someone in the back of the tent muttered, and a suspicion spread like oil. Someone called Eleanor's name, and she felt as if the floor dropped out from under her. She rose, palms sweating on the edge of the table, and spoke the truth again, the calculation she had made months ago, why she had done it, how she had carried the memory. She said it plainly, without filigree. She did not beg. She did not excuse. The room listened. Some faces hardened, others softened. At the end of her statement, Patton leaned forward and said, with a sweetness like a guillotine's edge, "Then you knew risk, you took it." Arden's reply was immediate and cold. She signed for that night with a captain who begged for an extra margin. The conditions were different.
The decision cannot be collapsed into simplistic culpability. His voice had lost something in the exchange, maybe the part that it sought to shelter. We have to look at intent, context, chain of command. Patton's smile was a practiced thing. Context is a nice word, General Arden, but men died tonight. The public must see that negligence is punished. The murmur rose. Arden watched her then, and for a second she thought he would stop Patton with a personal intervention, demand mercy, defy the spectacle. Instead, he reached into the procedural kit he had prepared and withdrew a statement that was the color of law. He would defend her within the system. He would not simply arrest the system's inclination to publicly punish. When the gavel came and the decision was to refer the matter for court-martial, Eleanor felt the air leave the room in a gust. The paperwork was antiseptic. It smelled of a future being carved. Men shuffled, took sides, offered the polite condolences of those who do not follow the wounded home. Later, in the dental gray light of an exhausted dawn, Arden found her at the map table, the place where their confidences had lived and been tendered like fragile supplies. He did not look like a man who had saved her by the formal processes he could marshal. He looked like a man who had burned a tiny match and then realized how quickly it could set a whole tent on fire. "You need to prepare," he said, and the sentence felt like a verdict. For what? Her voice was blunt. She had always imagined a world would need courage. She had not imagined the cost of owning it. For the hearing, for questions about judgment, for being asked to be small in public while being honest in private. He waited, and the waiting made his next words heavier. "I will be there for you. I will not make speeches that save me, but damn you." The admission was a hard, small mercy. It did not erase the fact that he had not thrown himself bodily between Patton and his fury. It simply named the calculus, that he would fight, but as a general, with the measured weapons of his rank. Eleanor felt betrayed and oddly grateful both, as if two different currencies were being exchanged, and she had to choose which to spend. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper she had been given to prepare her testimony. He reached out, briefly, and touched the back of her hand, a contact that was not a promise of safety, but of solidarity. "You could walk away," she said, not because she wanted to, but because the shape of the world offered it as an option. "I could," he said, "and maybe one day I will.
But not now. Not while you are standing in front of men who will mistake haste for valor. His eyes searched hers and found something like apology in the face of the woman he had come to value. Between them there was now a fault line, not of love ended, but of trust tested. Arden's reserve, once a comfort, was now a necessary barricade.
Eleanor's openness, once courageous, was now a fitful weapon that could be turned by others. They had been intimate in ways that mattered. Confessions, hands touching over maps, a cigarette shared like a secret. But the war had stripped their intimacy of naivete. It had traded warmth for consequence. The fracture that formed was not dramatic. It was practical and precise. Each chose a side of the room to stand on. Arden with his command and the instruments of his protection. Eleanor with her raw truth and the public reckoning it demanded. When she left the tent to prepare for the formal inquiry, she felt the love between them become a ledger, something to be accounted for in margins and statements. As she walked away, Arden watched her until the tent flap's side closed. For the first time since their truths had braided together, they were not in the same shelter. Outside, the base was a hive of muted noise. The men and women who had trusted in their liaisons and generals were back at their posts, doing the small, heroic things that made a life. Eleanor felt small among them, and yet enormous with the knowledge that she could either cower or confess. She chose to confess. The decision did not feel noble. It felt inevitable. It would break things. It would also, perhaps, unearth a possibility that truth and love might survive the public test. She did not yet know if Arden would stand before the tribunal as the man who loved her, or as the general who loved his command. The only thing she knew for certain, secrets had begun to fracture everything. What remained to be seen was whether the fractures would empty them both, or whether they would, in the end, let them see the full, imperfect shapes of each other. Arden found her in the washroom of the mess, where the light was too harsh, and the mirror showed every line the war had written on skin. She had been awake all night sharpening truths like knives. When he stepped in, he closed the door behind him as if shutting out the rest of the world. Patton's rumble, the whispering tent, the slow unthreading of their private life. "You looked like the map had not forgiven you," he said, and the small attempt at levity landed with a painful grace. She let herself laugh once, brittle and short. "Maps don't forgive," she whispered. "They only keep tally." He crossed the room and took both of her hands, steadying them the way a surgeon steadies a hand that is about to operate without anesthetic. "Then let me be your counterbalance," he said. "I won't promise to stop the world from turning ugly, but I will stand so that it turns with you in it." The hearing that followed was a dry, precise thing, men in uniforms cataloging errors and intentions like evidence in a temperate court. Eleanor sat at the witness table and felt every gaze as if it were a probe. She said the facts plainly. No flourish, no evasion. How she had signed off months ago, why she had done it, how she had lived with the result. Her voice did not waver when questions tried to weaponize her fear. She spoke in measured honesty and in the language she had always trusted. Numbers, log. She said the facts plainly. No flourish, no evasion. How she had signed off months ago, why she had done it, how she had lived with the result. Her voice did not waver when questions tried to weaponize her fear. She spoke in measured honesty and in the language she had always trusted. Numbers, logs, human names. When Patton's counsel painted her action as reckless, as the symptom of a young liaison's misplaced confidence, the tent muttered approval. Arden rose then, not as a lover pleading, but as a general with the authority of half a life's command. He did not shield her with euphemism. Instead, he unfolded truth in the same deliberate cadence he used to brief a wing. "You can make me scapegoat," he said, and air in the room thickened. "You can file the neat bundles of blame you crave. Or you can look at the chain we serve, the men who gave orders and the men who passed them along. I accept command responsibility. I was the man charged with the air picture tonight. I could have insisted on more reconnaissance myself. I could have fought harder against a diversion I believed incompetent. For that, I will answer." Murmurs ran like a wind through tents. Patton's face went unreadable for a beat, then red as mammoth wood. Arden continued, each sentence a nailed plank on a confession that would not let him off easy. "If a sacrifice is demanded,
Let mine be the one offered. I will stand down from command pending inquiry. I will accept whatever consequence the board deems fit. I will not let a young officer's career be ended to salve the wounds of others' haste. Eleanor's world narrowed until it was only the sound of her breath. To see him give up the very thing that had allowed him to protect her in the margins felt like watching a bridge lower itself into the flood to carry someone across. The sacrifice was not theatrical, it was the measured abdication of power. It shone with the terrible, quiet honor of a man who would rather lose his badge than let her lose her future. Patton's outrage was instant and animal. You can't cede command to avoid accountability, he thundered, but even his bark lacked the force of the fact Arden offered. A commander's confession, given before the crowd, stripped the spectacle of its pleasure. The inquiry still had teeth, the board could still find faults, but Arden had altered the ledger. He had made a different currency of blame. Alone, afterward, in the hollow of the operations tent, Eleanor found him raw and small in a way that resembled grief. He had not decorated his sacrifice with rhetoric. He had simply handed the tribunal a truth that would likely cost him more than most men would pay. "You could have saved yourself," she said, fingers cold on the map. "I could have," he answered. "But would I have saved you? Would I have been able to look at you in a year and not remember that I had stayed and watched you take the fall alone? No, I will not live with that ledger."
She wanted to protest that she would have preferred to take the blow herself. She wanted to tell him that his career was not something she could see him throw away in the name of something that felt like pity. But there was bravery in the smallness of his surrender, and it drew a new honesty from her. "You are not saving me by stepping away," she said softly. "You are joining me on the ledge." He smiled, the kind that was not light but luminous. "Then let us jump together," he said, and the ridiculousness of phrase and the depth of intention it held made the tent feel suddenly too small for the both of them. They did not become soppy lovers in that instant. The war did not allow for softness to last. Instead, they planned legal counsel, witness logs, meticulous timelines. They traded the intimacy of shared cigarettes for the intimacy of shared folding maps, of hands touching over paper as they pinned down facts that could save them both. Arden's confession shifted the hunt. Patton could still claw for spectacle, but it was harder now. Arden's ardor had become a shield made of truth. When the board convened, Arden's resignation in hand, it was the public that took a breath. Some called him foolhardy, others called him noble. Eleanor heard both in the roar. She stood at his side as the tribunal narrated facts and context, and when it was her turn, she did not flinch. Their joint testimony was not a plea for leniency. It was an offer of mutual truth. The outcome split them in ways that hurt and healed. Arden was relieved of command pending review. His future was uncertain, a fog of possible commendation and possible censure. Eleanor's record bore no criminal negligence finding, but it was stamped with the weight of hard lessons and a reprimand that would follow her like a shadow in papers and promotions. The justice of war rarely felt like justice. It felt like a compromise between force and mercy. After the board, in the quiet that follows announced consequence, they walked outside into a sky that smelled of rain and new reckoning. No promises were carved into that air. Only a hand, calloused, sure, found hers. He did not vow that there would be awards or restored command. He did not speak of futures he could not promise. He only said, "We will rebuild. If you want me on your side, I am there. Not as a general who shields you with rank, but as a man who has chosen to bear what comes beside you." She leaned into him because there was no battlefield where she wanted to be more exposed, because love, when it was real, did not demand the saving a life so much as the bearing of it together. He had given up power and not dignity. He had offered himself as a companion on a hard road. She kissed him, not with the naive rush of a stolen moment, but with the solemnity of a soldier making an oath. The sacrifice grounded them rather than broke them. Arden's career would be a longer story. Eleanor's would be complex. But the thing that mattered in that rain-swept hour was not the titles they kept or lost. It was that two people had chosen each other against the geometry of rank and rumor. They returned to the tent hand in hand, no longer two people merely balancing a bridge between generals, but architects of a new kind of alliance. The map lay open, its pins like stars. But the thing that mattered in that rain-swept hour was not the titles they kept or lost. It was that two people had chosen each other against the geometry of rank and rumor. They returned to the tent hand in hand, no longer two people merely balancing a bridge between generals, but architects of a new kind of alliance. The map lay open, its pins like stars. Under the jaundiced lamp, they bent to their work. Charts to correct, reports to file, lives to reckon. Outside, the war kept its rhythm. Planes still flew, engines still hummed, men still folded quietly in their bunks. Inside, they had a small steadiness. Hap Arden had said the thing that mattered most when every man demanded action. He had turned action into a choice, one that included truth and a willingness to pay for it. That willingness, rare and costly, became the kind of love that did not excuse, but accounted. It asked for sacrifice and returned care. In the calculus of consequence, they had chosen one another. And in the weeks that followed, when the base readjusted to the new normal, when rumors cooled into routine, they learned the hardest lesson. Courage is not always the loudest voice in the tent. Sometimes it is the quiet act of stepping away from command to stand with the person you have come to love. They walked back through the tent as partners in a life that had been redesigned by consequence. The maps between them were no longer battlegrounds, but the ledger of what they had chosen together. Flight paths marked not only with pens, but with the names of men they would not let be reduced to statistics. Arden's resignation hung like a shadow around him, but his step beside her was steady, not wavering. Eleanor felt the odd lightness of someone who had told the truth and been answered with the rare currency of sacrifice. Life did not soften overnight. Patton's mouth still found new ways to demand a cost, and rumors circled like gulls over a harbor, waiting for something to fall. The reprimand on Eleanor's record sat with her like a quiet stone, heavy and factual. Arden's absence from command became a daily ache in the air of the operations tent, noticed in the way fewer people sought him out for counsel, and in the way mail piled on his desk unread. But where they had expected shame and ruin, they found instead a strange steadiness. Colleagues who had watched a man accept blame to shield another now regarded them in a different light. Respect rearranged itself not as flattery, but as recognition. They learned to inhabit the new normal with small rituals. In the evenings, after reports were filed and the lamps burned low, they would meet at the map table and speak of things that were not on any docket: the quiet of a sky before dawn, a book to be read when the war ended, a town to visit if there was ever time for such a thing.
Both taught the other how to forgive themselves. When paperwork finally loosened its grip and Arden's status moved from limbo towards a review that would take its own shape with time, they did not celebrate with grand gestures. Instead, they went outside to the field where the plains had once preferred the night. Both taught the other how to forgive themselves. When paperwork finally loosened its grip and Arden's status moved from limbo towards a review that would take its own shape with time, they did not celebrate with grand gestures. Instead, they went outside to the field where the plains had once preferred the night. Rain had washed the concrete clean. Puddles reflected the low, honest light. They stood there with their hands entwined over a map that had long since been folded flat. Eleanor placed her thumb on a pin, then his, and left a smudge of ink and skin. 2 small, imperfect marks on the paper that would not erase. "We will be less careless with the numbers," she said, voice small with conviction, "and less afraid to be seen with the costs." He covered their prints with his palm, warm and sure. "And we'll keep naming the cost when someone tries to hide it in courage," he answered. "We'll be honest about mistakes, about mercy, about who we are." They stood a while longer, listening to the distant cadence of engines and the softer rhythm of men settling into the next watch. Above them, a sliver of pale sky opened like a promise. It was not a victory, not yet. It was simply weather changing. In that small cleft of light, their hands were not an act of defiance, but of pact, that whatever came next, courtroom or commendation, exile or reprieve, they would shoulder it together. The map lay between them, edges wet with drizzle and imprinted with 2 fingerprints, the faint dark of ink like a vow. Beyond the runway, the horizon kept its plain, indifferent line. Within it, 2 people had found a way to tenderly, stubbornly keep one another whole.